Okay, thought I'd do a quickie podcast here on processing an image in Lightroom and using a combination of Photoshop. So let's first take a look at the image. I'm going to open up in Faststone, and this is the one right here. And let's see if we can get it to open up. There we go. Alright, pretty crummy image actually. It's a little blurry, as we can see. A couple of people walking on a rock. Got a cardboard border around it. Alright. Now, I've had this into Lightroom before. Let me open up Lightroom. Okay, we've got it down here in Lightroom. And you see, in Lightroom, I've cropped it already to get rid of the cardboard border, basically. So what I want to do is go into the develop mode of Lightroom and see if we can do a little work on this image. Now, basically, first couple of things I do, since this was a copy of a slide, when I bring it into Lightroom, I have some user presets that I've defined over here on the left-hand side. One is a correction for the lens I'm using, to correct for a little bit of barrel distortion and pincushion distortion. And you can see it popped the image just a little bit when I clicked on it. The other thing I'm going to do is correct for a little bit of noise that might have been picked up when I was copying the slide. Okay, so we've done that. Now the next thing to do is go over and look at the panels over here. We have a whole bunch of controls we can control. And I'm just going to take a quick look here. If we look up at the histogram, what we have basically is a relatively low contrast image. But the colors aren't very intensified. Now I can intensify them here in Lightroom, but if I do, it's going to apply the intensity to all of the colors, or I can go in and selectively try to work on selected colors. One of the problems is if I just bring up the intensity to colors, and I can do that with vibrance. Let's try the vibrance command. See if I bring up the vibrance. Yeah, okay, it brings up the greens, it brings up the reds, it brings up the yellows, but unfortunately it brings up the rocks and brings up some purple and magenta, which is in the rocks. That probably wasn't really in the image from what I remember of it. The problem is it picked it up, I think, because I had the white balance not properly set in the dark areas when I copied the slide. So I really have to go in and fix that. So I'd rather not play around with the colors in Lightroom here. I'd rather do that in Photoshop, where it's a little easier to control things. I can control it here to some extent with adjustment brushes, but I really don't want to go that route. So I'm going to look over here in our history palette, and I'm basically going to back it up one step to get rid of that color correction. In terms of brightness corrections, the other thing I'd like to do is sort of do an overall intensification of the colors of the rest of the colors using a luminosity mask when we take it over into Photoshop. So to do that, it doesn't hurt any to lighten up the image a little bit here. And in theory, if I hold down the Alt key and go up to exposure and click on the exposure, I can see where I start blowing out some highlights. Alright, and see that looks pretty, at least on my screen here at home, that looks very overexposed. I'm going to back that off a little bit, just to where the highlights start to burn out. Okay, and maybe just a little bit more yet. Okay, that's good. Alright, and then just to be assured that I'm not blowing out completely, for example, the rock behind my friend Tom, I'm going to go into the recovery slider, bring that up a bit, just to knock down that highlight a little bit. Okay. Now, normally I play around with the fill light here, but I don't really need to do that. I mean, frankly, we don't have a lot of shadows or dark areas to start with. I can bring up the blacks a little bit. Again, if I go to the black slider, hold down the Alt key and click, and slowly move it up. Oh, at some point, there it is. When we start seeing color, those things are turning a pure black. Okay. So let's just stop just short of that, right about there. All right. And we can see what happened as we turn this little rock right here just a little too much black. So let me back that off just a little bit. All right. And frankly, that's about all I'm going to do in here. I could bring up the clarity here, but I'd rather do that with the contrast enhancement. It does the same thing, but I do it later in the process over in Photoshop. Okay. So to move this over to Photoshop, all I have to do is go down to the thumbnail, right click on it and tell it to export. And I've created a preset which basically adds a letter P to the current file name, saves it to the hard drive, opens it in Photoshop, and after we come back out of Photoshop, it'll bring it back in and stack it with the original image in Lightroom. So we're switching over here to Photoshop, opening up the image, and let me blow it up a little bit. Okay, and like I said, what I like to do here is do a luminosity mask on this right away. If I come down, I've got an action created to do luminosity mask, and I'm going to finish the mask. All right, and we can see what that did. If I turn it off, turn it back on. All right, I like what it did to the colors. It's made the image a bit dull, but I can bring that up with the exposure. And you notice it didn't bring up the reds in here as much as we had gotten in Lightroom when we just jacked up the saturation. To further prevent this from occurring, because I want to keep these fairly light, what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to add a mask to this luminosity layer. And I'm going to go with black and a paintbrush. Okay. And we better get a considerably bigger brush than that. And I'm basically just going to paint over these areas that I frankly don't really need to have darkened that much. And this is doing two things for me. One is preventing the color from enhancing from what it was, and it's lightening up these areas so that I have a little more to work with. Okay. And of course you can always go too far in Photoshop, and I often do. Alright, let's work on that. Maybe do that rock there. Let's try a little bit of these. Okay, work around the edge. Come down here, work around that bush. Alright, let's take a look at the mask. If I hold down the Alt key, go over to the Layers palette and click on the mask, it shows us the mask, and you can see I missed a few areas, so let's just sort of fill those in. Okay, hold down the Alt key, click one more time on the mask, toggle it back. Alright. So we basically got that part of the image looking all right. At this point, I want to add a local contrast enhancement action. This is the same thing as clarity. And I like to add it at this point because I don't want to have anything near a blown highlight. Because when you do this, you can blow out a highlight that's almost blown out, but not completely. All right. So let's see what that did for us. Okay, that's off, that's on, that's off, that's on. All right, so that's getting more toward what I was hoping to see here. All right, now let's go in and fine-tune the exposures a bit. I'm going to go into an adjustment layer for levels, and I'm just going to bring in the right slider quite a bit. I'm going to bring in the left slider a little bit. I'm going to take the middle slider and move it a bit to the right. All right. And I'm happy with that. I say OK. Now I've got a few spots that I did blow out completely. So I'm going to click on the mask. I'm going to get black as the foreground color. Get a nice soft paintbrush. Come over, and if you watch this little rock right behind Tom, boop, just going to knock down those highlights a bit. So I don't really want them blowing out in the image if I can help it. If I do it a little more carefully, we can hit some of these hot ones up here. And maybe that one right there. All right, that's enough. We want to leave a few little highlights in. We don't want to necessarily take out everything, but anything that's distracting to us, right there. Okay, so I'm relatively happy with the image at this stage. I'm going to flatten the image, and make another copy of the new background layer, and go up to the filter menu, go to sharpen, go to unsharp mask. The image is pretty blurry, so I need to sharpen it a bit. You can look over here at the picture of Tom. I'm going to need to give it a little bit more. So I'm going to be up around 170 on the sharpness, on the amount, 1.3 for the radius, 0 for the threshold. Say OK to that. Let's look at a before and an after. If I turn the eye on. Okay, that's before, that's after. You can't see much difference. Let me blow it up. Okay, that's the before, that's the after. All right. All right, I'm going to live with that. And now we're going to flatten this layer. And now we're going to return back to Lightroom. So I'm going to go to File and Save. And it tells me that the disk copy was changed. Since we last opened it and saved it, do we want to save it anyway? And I'm going to say OK to that. And I'm going to save it with a quality of 11. Now I can close the image in Photoshop, go back over to Lightroom. All right. We come back over into Lightroom and we come down here. It stacked the image for us. You see the original image doesn't have the letter P on it. It's just 610 or 1610. All right. And if I look inside the stack here, all right, this is the image that we have worked on now. All right. Now notice when it comes back into from Photoshop into Lightroom, Lightroom notices that we've changed it, and it says the metadata was changed externally. That's because I used a save command and it saved it, a new copy, to the hard drive. So if I click here to resolve the difference, basically it says the metadata for this photo has been changed by another application, in this case Photoshop. Should Lightroom import settings from the disk or overwrite the disk settings with those from this catalog? And what I want to do is I want to import the settings from the disk, because those are the new metadata settings we're going to use here. Okay, so we have the image here. You notice it is, let me close the stack, go to stack, and I collapse the stack. So now it only shows when I look down below. If I go back a couple of pictures and I go forward, each of these is two pictures, a before and an after, but you notice it's only showing the after picture in this case. Okay, so that's all there is to it. At this point, I'm going to close this podcast.